All right, Doug, let's talk about flooding. And I really want to talk about the effectiveness of flood terminology.
Right.
Can you tell me a little bit about what exactly it means when someone references a 100-year flood?
Sure. And there is a lot of, um, there's been a lot of discussion over the years of the best way to try to communicate flood risk. And the 100-year is a term that honestly goes back to when the beginning of looking at a national flood mapping program. There was some folks in the University of Chicago, Gilbert F. White, who was kind of considered the father of floodplain management. They were basically, there was a group trying to figure out what's a good probability to start looking at if we start doing studies and mapping would help the country figure out what the flood risk is. And it ended up kind of just being an arbitrary, oh, let's just do the 100-year. Well, what does that really mean? And it's been that language sort of caught on. But the most common misperception of that is that that the 100-year will only occur once a century, and that isn't true. I mean, there's a small probability that an intense event could occur every year, and that's the point. And that's kind of why agencies like FEMA and I work for NOAA, we try to refer to it now as in a percent instead, which is really just a reciprocal. And which would be the 1%, which means in every given year, there's a 1% chance you could experience that level or intensity. And really what it comes down to is, it's just, and stop me if I ramble, it comes down to, there's a probability distribution with any event that you record over time, whether it's water levels or, economics, money, whatever, you're kind of looking at what we call like a return period. So it's based on looking at historical data, either on rivers, for instance. At rivers, it would look at like stream gauges and look at how over the period of record, how many extreme events have we had, and then it just basically do a statistical analysis and figure out what this probability distribution is. The 1% would be more on the extreme side, and then there's like a 10%. There's even something higher in floodplain mapping, which is the 0.2%, which is the 500-year. So it's just a way to kind of characterize what we are looking for in floodplain management is what is called flood risk, which is probability of a flood happening times the consequence. So you have to know how likely is it to happen, and then what area is going to be affected by that, and figure out what's the economic impact or the consequence. And that's really what it comes down to. That's why we do flood mapping to begin with. We map the 1%, pretty extreme event, we overlay that. We map that area and we overlay what's underneath that in terms of the impacts on infrastructure and everything else to come up with a flood risk. And obviously, so where more population lives, you have a higher risk, depending on what you're studying for the risk.
Okay, so geographic location makes a difference. Say what's going on in California right now, what a 100-year flood looks like there may be different than what a 100-year flood may look like on the East Coast somewhere.
Well, no, not the probability side of things. I mean, yes, it differs by location, especially, but you can consider the probability of the event happening kind of separately from what is going to be impacted, because the combining those two together is really the risk. So it's a probability of an event happening. Say all these rain events they've had in California, all the atmospheric rivers, they're on like their 12th atmospheric river incident this year. The probability of that happening, but also what's in harm's way, and that combination gives you the risk. So a place where there's no population and there's depending on how you determine what is at risk. If you're using only infrastructure and people and all that kind of stuff, then a place where there's none of that, then there's really not as much flood risk, even though the probability might be the same. Does that make sense?
Yep,
So
exactly.
it really comes down to what you're sort of trying to get a handle on what's at risk. Now there's ecology, environmental risk, and maybe that no one lives there, but let's say it's a national shoreline or national, like the Outer Banks or something like that. There may be areas there's no one lives there, but there's a tourism value, aesthetic value, and if you start valuing that, then there is risk there too. For instance, the National Parks Service manages all of these national seashores, and though there are not necessarily infrastructure and buildings there, it's a natural resource. It's a tourism destination, so they look at the risk part of that equation very differently, but they're still using the same flood probability information to do that.
So okay, go ahead. I was going to say, who's kind of in charge of this terminology? Is it the USGS, the United States Geological Survey?
I don't know if anybody like really owns the terminology. It's a way to characterize the probability in the literature, and I believe now most of the agencies like USGS, and they're going to be doing it more on the rivers, right? And whereas NOAA, we do more of on a coastal, although NOAA does do river forecasting, so they do deal with river information. We've gotten away from the terminology 100-year flood or 500-year flood because it does confuse people, and it really makes people think, oh, well, we had a 100-year event. I'll give you an example. Here in Charleston back in 2015, 2015, we had that massive rain event. It was kind of associated with Hurricane Joaquin, although Joaquin was way far away from the coast. That kind of was sort of our version of an atmospheric river on the East Coast, just pumping in moisture. We had 24 inches of rain or something north of Charleston. And it was characterized by looking at precipitation gauges as like a 1,000-year rain event. And something else to point out is that a precip event, like a 1,000-year rain event, is captured by a precipitation gauge, which is essentially just a gauge that measures how much rainfall fell, versus a flood is different. So a 1,000-year rainfall event does not equal a 1,000-year flood. The flooding component is really how the water, once it hits the land, how does it run off and flow through the watershed, through the system, and what's in the way, what's the land use, what's the channel look like in the hydraulics. That determines the flood height. So there's a lot more factors that go into to an actual flood. So that event was a 1,000-year rainfall event, but it was nowhere near. It was not even quite even, I think in some places, a 100-year flood event. So it just depends on how you characterize that. And here I am using 100-year. We're trying to get away from that 1%. Right. So every year you have a 1% chance. Yeah, I'll stop there, and you can.
So it's funny because this seems like the intention here was kind of to, for statistical reasons, but the public takes this terminology and the media takes the terminology and kind of runs with it a little bit. So even if you're trying to get away from it, do you think that the public will still kind of like that fun, dramatic terminology of, well, that was a 100-year flood, or that was a 10-year flood that we had?
Yeah, I do. I think, unfortunately, this is human nature. We like bigger numbers mean worse or better sometimes, right? It's like, we're all concerned about, we're trying to make more money, so bigger numbers are better. And then in some cases, bigger numbers, obviously with things like fatalities, bigger numbers are worse, and that kind of thing. So to say a 100-year event or a 500-year event, that seems more dramatic to some people than that's a 1% chance event. Like, that sounds like, not that bad. So really, it's just it's just flipping it on its head, and mathematically it's just 1 over 100 versus 100 over 1. And you know, you're basically mathematically describing the same thing, but it's just different how words have you know, different connotations. But one of the things that folks have tried to do is put it in a little bit different terms, and I'll send you some graphics, but many people don't understand how risky building it is to build in flood zones. So one of the ways they've been trying to communicate that is the percent of one or more floods of given magnitude in a 30-year period, because that kind of relates to people's mortgages. You know, a 30-year fixed mortgage. How much flood risk am I going to have when I buy this house and I finance it for 30 years? And the banks want to know that too, right? Because they're the ones financing. So what it comes down to is if you're buying it for a 30-year mortgage and you're building a floodplain, a 1% floodplain, then there's a 26% chance that you're going to be flooded within that 30-year period. And that makes a much bigger impact on people. Like, oh, 26%, that's a lot more than 1% every year. And just to put that in perspective, the chance for a major fire is going to occur is like something like less than 5% over the 30-year mortgage. So you have a higher percent chance if you build in a floodplain that's mapped, special flood hazard area, you have a higher percent chance of getting flooded than you do being impacted by a fire. So it's just how you do the numbers and communicate that.
How do you adjust the numbers as time is going on and we're constantly seeing new information? Because I'm guessing a 100-year flood could happen much more frequently in the past decade than perhaps 100 years ago or 200 years ago with rising sea levels.
Exactly. Yeah, and that is how we come up with the 1% right now is even sometimes problematic, because we are relying on historical data. For riverine flooding, we're relying on stream flow information from gauges, and it all comes down to the period of record. How long was that gauge there collecting data? In some cases, we only have 30 years, maybe if you're really lucky, 50 to 70 years of data. And then you're trying to extrapolate what the 1% chance is. So you have less data than you actually have the time frame that you're trying to get the analysis. That comes into play when you look at the 0.2% as well, which is the 500-year. We don't have 500 years worth of data. We don't have that anywhere. But we're extrapolating what we do have, and then as you get farther out, there's a big uncertainty. So there's like a range in there. So coming up with these probabilities just based on the existing data is problematic, which is why it's so important to keep gauges where they are. First, to have more of them, but have them be there long enough to establish a period of record. For instance, on the coast, NOAA maintains the National Water Level Observation Network, and there's 220 or so tide gauges around the country. The longest one's been there for about 156 years or something like that. It's in San Francisco. So the longer the period of record, you have a better idea of the certainty of a 1% chance event. But going back to what you were saying, we have looking at how climate change is going to make a difference here, and also future land use. More population in these areas are going to develop watersheds. More impervious surface causes more runoff. If we do man-made, canals and stuff and ditching and whatnot to get the water off of properties, then we're going to increase the amount of flow coming into rivers, and that's going to change. So there's a climate change impact, and then there's a sort of the anthropocentric or people-based impact. That's going to change the flood risk over time. So we're entering into something we call, this is kind of science mumbo jumbo, but what we call non-stationarity, which is I like to say, as a geologist, you always say, well, the past is the key to the future, right? We know what happened in the past. That's going to tell us what's happening now. But in this case, the past is not the key to the future, because we know that things are changing, more land use changes, more people moving to, for instance, coastal areas, more construction. And then obviously more climate impacts, especially with sea level rise. We know that we've seen increases in the rates of sea level rise in the last 100 years. In Charleston, we've seen a foot of sea level rise in the last 100 years. And we're expected to see the last technical report that came out last February, not this past, was saying it's an interagency report that NOAA had part in, that we're going to see about another foot in the next 30 years. So by 2050, we'll see another foot of sea level rise. So that's obviously going to change the flood risk and really multiply the impacts much quicker than what we've seen in the past. So that's why you see sea level curves go, they start going up, whereas you may have done a linear regression in the past, which is a straight fit line through the whole record. Now you're starting to see what would you call a more quadratic curve, not to get into the math, but basically you're starting to see that change. And so to take that into account, we need to start, when we do flood risk mapping and things, we need to take account what's the future floodplain going to look like by putting in some of these scenarios of higher water levels. And that will increase the base flood elevation, which is like at your location and your house, like how the relationship of the base flood is to your like first floor elevation, but also the expansion of the floodplain. So if you increase the vertical, it's going to increase horizontally too. There's actually, and this is the federal government, which I work for, something called the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, which it's kind of building on an executive order that's been around since the Carter administration, basically saying that for federal investments, like a new building, try not to build in the current floodplain if you can. And if you do have to, make sure you're trying to build resiliently or, flood proof. So you can reduce the risk. Now this new executive order is saying, well, we need to look at the future floodplain too. So any federal investment, let's say after a disaster like Hurricane Sandy happened, and let's say Housing and Urban Development, HUD, is putting out block development grants for redevelopment, they're going to put a requirement in there that you build back. And if you're in the current floodplain, you've got to make sure you're building up high enough to be out of the future floodplain, looking at like sea level rise. And that's going to help us, hopefully take into account the changing climate and some of the man-made changes too. So, and it really just comes down to trying to, the more we can put into, and there's this sort of adage, like they've done a lot of studies, every dollar you invest in flood mitigation, including raising buildings and things like that now, freeboard, that's going to save up to $4 to $6 eventually down the road. It's a bigger investment initially, but over the long run, it's going to save you money.
Hey, thank you so much for watching. While you're here, check out some other videos you just may like.